us in Discipleship Podcast.
Here we are again, our favorite time of the week, and I hope you enjoy tuning in and sharing these opportunities with us. We are prisoners of hope every week. We hope we're sharing with you the good news of the gospel and how it impacts our day-to-day lives, as well as you and I talked about before we went live here, kind of looking at the autopsy of America. Not that we're dead, but I guess doing the diagnosis and realizing we got some sickness in the body here, but we're never depressed. We have, first of all, I guess we have to look at what's going on around us with our eyes wide open, and we need to know what's happening, and that's why we're doing this wonderful book and talking about the ideas in this book, Strange New World by Carl Trueman, because it really helps us understand just the crazy, strange, as he calls it, strange new world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, he really connects the ideas. We see the symptoms, we see the objective actualization of these crazy ideas, and we just don't understand how could someone think that way. Right. So what Carl Trueman does is kind of lay out the principles.
But the fact that we now understand why people think that way doesn't change.
It doesn't make me feel better.
Yeah,
it just makes me understand it more.
Exactly. It's just like, oh, that's why we're so messed up.
Well, even this first idea of talking about the whole pro-choice and how they see life. It was illuminating for me to see this. Oh, that's why.
So this, if you're following along in the book, which we encourage you to pick up a copy, this is the Cliff Notes version of his big book. If you're someone who really likes to do a deep dive into these topics, he's got the mother book. This is the baby book, and I hope you've enjoyed it. We just try to take a chapter a week, and then Andrew and I kind of process it through our own grid. Yeah. But this chapter was called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, and of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that title comes directly from the Declaration of Independence, one of our founding documents, in which the Declaration says these are inalienable rights that we get from God: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And what's crazy is with the rise of expressive individualism, which we've been highlighting, these kind of sacrosanct, sacred, foundational, pillars that we all just take for granted as Americans are actually under assault. And you just mentioned one of the areas.
Well, it's been redefined.
Yes.
They start with redefinition. I mean, that's, if you want to attack a problem or change culture, you don't start with the symptom, you start with the root.
So you don't throw the Constitution out. That would be kind of a little bit of a challenging effort right there. Right. But what you do is you just redefine the words.
Yeah.
And if you can redefine the words, then the original document doesn't mean what it was intended.
Don't mean what you want it to mean.
Yeah, you shape it in your own theological or orthodox, whatever it is. But it's interesting with this whole idea of personhood being internalized. So it's no longer about our bodies or about our neighborhoods or about the shared community that we're part of. We talked about that. Now it's become psychological. And personhood is really a matter of consciousness. So talk about this because in other words, if a person's not able to self-reflect, analyze, be aware of themselves, be aware of the world around them. In other words, we're talking about babies in the womb. We're talking about folks that are maybe elderly and dealing with dementia. How does this radical expressive individualism impact our understanding of personhood, especially in areas like abortion?
Right, so specifically you talk about the right to life, like the fundamental right to life, right? How have that been redefined?
Yeah. So Christian view, for instance, we believe that at conception, life begins, and that is scientifically, biologically a fact. That's not what our opponents believe about this.
Right.
How have they shifted?
Right. So, I mean, I don't know if I can explain this because I just understand this concept myself. But, for us to look at life, there's a psychological component, there's a spiritual component, but there's also a physical component. Right. It's really important, the physical component, because when we go and see whether you're alive or you're dead, they check your heart rate,
your pulse.
They want it. There's a physical, biological component to life. Life is not just one component, but when you have reduced life to just the psychological, the emotional, like that you can feel, you can have self-determination. That's where life is.
It's very reductionistic, and let me just say most theories of personhood or humanity apart from the Lord give us a very reductionistic view. You got the other side of the coin. You got naturalism, which simply says all you are is matter.
Right.
So now naturalism denies anything, like you just said, of feelings, emotions, the spirit. All you are is matter. And then now we have people who are, let's talk about worldview disconnect. We got people who are evolutionists, who are also expressive individualists, and they give no foundation for where their feelings or why we should focus on the self, because where does the self come from, right? If all that exists is chemicals and matter. But nevertheless, even like Peter Singer. Peter Singer is an ethicist at Princeton University. He was an advisor to certain presidential administrations, Clinton's for one. He argues that embryos possess life, but they are not persons. This sounds like the same separation or wedge between biology and
gender and sex. Gender and sex has been compartmentalized. Now we're compartmentalized life and persons.
So there's a life inside the womb of the mother, but it's not necessarily a person. Why is it not a person? Before we would say, well, if there's life, that's obviously a person.
Right.
But now they're saying, wait, no, that embryo does not yet possess the power of self-consciousness, awareness, desires, dreams, all those kinds of things.
Well, we assume they don't.
Right.
I mean, we even they talking about the elderly with dementia.
Right. So they've lost a sense of awareness, self-consciousness.
Well, as far as you can tell, but again, that's my question too: is how do you know for sure that they are not aware? Are you know for sure that they don't have longing dreams and so forth? Just from your perspective, they don't, but you don't know they. That's a slippery slope, because there will be people who will be like, "Hey, you guys are scums." You can make all kind of statements about people, but you don't really.
But so, for instance, we're shocked that people would deny a child in the womb personhood. That's a shocking statement for those of us from a Christian worldview. We're also shocked that we would look at an elderly person who's dealing with dementia and assume that their life is now expendable and we can just kill them. Because somehow their quality of life doesn't meet the standard. That's a shocking, obviously, idea. Or how about this? That when the baby is born, if we feel like the child's still not a person for whatever external things, then we can actually kill the baby after the baby's born.
This
is like paganism.
Well, this is the good question. Okay, by this definition, which I don't agree with, when do you become a person? When a child's 4, 5? When the child can read and write, when he can color within the lines? Like, when does personhood actually start? I mean, that's a question I would answer. I have a 9-month-old, and she's beautiful, and she's she's very strong-willed, and she knows what she wants and whatnot. So, what age is it different by person? You open up a can of worms, all kind of different questions when you start talking distinguishing personhood and life.
And what we end up with is, as he pointed out in the book, is a form of utilitarianism, which simply argues that our moral and ethical decisions should be constructed in such a way that we pursue the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people.
My goodness.
This is really scary kind of thinking.
That's a slippery slope too.
Absolutely. So now we're talking about, okay, if you find out that your child has a birth defect in the womb, or you find out that your baby is going to be Down syndrome baby, then the argument goes like this. It's a wicked argument. Let's just state this right up front. The argument goes, well, you know what? Is that child going to be happy? That's a hypothetical. Are we going to be happy? Is this child with his or her needs going to make our existence, my personal, expressive, radical individualism, am I going to be happier if I have to raise a child that's not physically perfect? What a horrific way to frame the issue. Obviously, these are moral issues, and these are not always easy situations to deal with. But because we believe in the sanctity of human life, and because we believe this child is made in the image and likeness of God, we value the personhood of this child, and we would do everything in our power to love this baby and give this baby the best life possible. In other words, It wasn't all about me and my personal happiness. In fact, we find people that could comment on this, that raise children that are Down syndrome children, and the incredible amount of joy and the incredible blessing that these children are. Right. So to somehow assume that this child is less worthy of life or less of a person simply because they're not perfect is just an evil, wicked thought. And yet that's where most of the elite intelligentsia is on this whole issue of abortion.
Well, even expressive individualism now is kind of turned on its head, because who are you to tell somebody what's joy? Even someone who has, who are severely handicapped in whatever area, do they not have expressive individualism to dictate? Maybe the lifestyle to you is not happy, but they're happy.
Right.
So
right.
It's become such a slippery slope, very vague.
Well, and these are not hypotheticals, because in states like Washington, some of our liberal states, Oregon, they were pushing for instance, assisted suicide. If it's all about you and your personal happiness and whatever you're the captain of your own ship, and all of a sudden you feel like you don't want to live, then these states give you the power for assisted suicide. Somebody who's sanctioned by the state can come alongside of you and basically kill you. And again, this all goes back to taking the authority out of God and out of His understanding of created in His image, and now you become God and you get to dictate your life on your terms. And again, this is a scary place to be in a culture when death is celebrated and death is justified on the basis of these ideas of expressive individualism. Yeah. This whole idea of psychological selfhood. So that was the abortion issue.
Well, it's life.
The life issue. But he also talks about modern liberty. He says freedoms once considered self-evident, like freedoms of speech, freedom of religion, are now under attack. We've got this cancel culture, and this was amazing to me, because I'll go back, for instance, to when marriage was being debated in Indiana, and I was wondering, how come our Christian universities are not talking about biblical marriage? And on the other hand, we saw Indiana University come right out and basically said, our institution, Indiana University, we believe in gay marriage, and basically any student on this campus who's not in line with that, your views are not acceptable, and are not going to be tolerated. I'm sitting there scratching my head thinking, what happened to higher education, where the goal of higher education, like you and I might not agree on everything, but we're pursuing truth, and so we might have a debate, and you might argue strongly your position, and I would argue strongly my position, and when the debate was over, I would shake your hand and congratulate you, and you'd congratulate me, and we'd wave at the audience, and hopefully everybody had a great educational experience because it was an exercise in critical thinking, right? And I was shocked that our secular institutions of higher education are almost squelching.
Funded by you and I, by the way.
Yeah, funded with our tax dollars. They're almost squelching this whole dynamic that is central to the American experiment and central to higher education, and it's called healthy public debate and being able to share differences of ideas and have a healthy tolerance for one another. Right. And that's gone.
And their perspective is that free speech is another moniker for oppression. So free speech, the purpose of free speech is to oppress you, is to you call it free speech, but really what it does is allow people the people of power, those people who are, whatever, the white, male, heteronormative, whatever, is to oppress you. So they don't want free speech, really, because it's repressive, and the right to liberty is to be liberated from this oppressiveness, which is caused by your free speech.
By your free speech.
So free speech, from their perspective, actually cause us to not have true liberty.
Yeah, and I probably, with my illustration, I probably jumped a little bit ahead because you're hitting the nail on the head. But let's back up a little bit, because the bigger issue, let's start with this, the whole issue of religious liberty. Yeah. Christians and quote religious people, we've often been despised as being naive, not thinking deeply, not being scientific, like those are old ideas and blah blah blah. But that's one thing. What we have now is not just you people are silly, I can't believe you believe that. We have an open hostility, hatred violence towards anything religious or anything about God. And so we found ourselves a while back being shocked that governments would actually be coming after Christian businesses for simply wanting to express a person's faith in the public arena, which is what the First Amendment, just to clarify, the First Amendment does not give you freedom to worship. That's something private. That's something that happens at church or something that happens between your ears or in your heart. That's not what the First Amendment gives you. It gives you freedom to practice your religion in the public arena. Now, this is huge. It means you cannot be forced at your workplace to violate your conscience or your religious beliefs. It means in the public arena, you have the right to speak about what your faith is. You have the right to share your faith. You have the right to honor the Lord. And you don't have to be ashamed or keep any of that secret or hidden. Now, with the rise of the sexual revolution, we see the fall of religious liberty in terms of freedom to express our beliefs. And this was most prominently displayed, again, in the cake battles, right? Christian bakers who simply said, you know what, I'm not going to use my artistic ability to create a birthday cake that celebrates gay marriage when the Bible clearly says gay marriage is not marriage at all. And we would say, all right, well, you have other options, and no one was being mean, just saying, I don't want your business. That we have the right to refuse business, especially business that goes against what we believe. But all of that was up for grabs, and now all of a sudden, this nice little old lady who's running a floral shop, or this young couple that just invested all their money to start this home business, they're being vilified publicly as haters, as bigots, simply for trying to stand up for what's true to their faith. How in the world do we get into that situation? And I guess what's the connection between expressive individualism and the assault on liberty?
That's a loaded question.
Well, I dealt with this firsthand, so let me get personal.
Yeah.
I dealt with this with Governor Pence.
Yeah.
And you remember it was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what it simply said was, a Christian who disagrees with the LGBTQ philosophy, lifestyle, whatever, should not be forced to hire people, for instance, who go against their biblical convictions, should not be forced to sacrifice their biblical convictions on the altar of the marketplace, all right? Of course, all of that, when that bill was signed into law, Indiana became the focal point. And it's interesting, he talks about that in his book. Indiana became the focal point of the LGBT movement, the mainstream media, corporate America. There were threats about all these businesses pulling out of Indianapolis, just destroying the Indianapolis economy. I mean, it was unbelievable. And simply all we were trying to do was protect the religious liberties of people. But at that very moment, what happened was religious liberty now fell under the banner of bigotry. And they're like, you're not going to hide behind your religious views as a banner or a cloak that's really hiding the fact that you hate people and that you are discriminating. That was the other big word, discriminating. I remember hearing our governor, Indiana is not a state that discriminates. And I kept thinking, Governor, we are making discriminations with every law that we pass.
We have to. Everybody's they're making discriminations.
To say that we're not discriminatory is making a discriminatory statement. Yeah. I mean, it's illogical, and we tried to say this is a collision course.
But what he was doing, he was appealing to rhetorics, and we're talking about actual logic.
Yes,
and that's why even when I heard him make those statements, I already know we lost.
Yeah,
because he's appealing to a rhetoric of this type of language, which is irrational because it contradicts itself at the very end. It's an appeal to power. It's an appeal to appeasing to those who are in power versus someone who may be like DeSantis, who's saying, we're not going to budge. This makes sense. We're not going to let little kids learn about these lifestyles.
Yeah, we're not going to be bullied. We're going to allow Hoosiers to operate their businesses.
You don't bully, especially when it's illogical. It doesn't make sense. I'm still fired up from back in 2000 and whatever.
I am too. Well, again, you brought out a good point. When we adopt the language of our ideological opponents, we lose. Yeah. That's why I refuse to use the language homophobe, gay, all these other things. That's the language. That's propagandistic language that as soon as we lose it, we start playing by their rules, and I refuse to play by their rules.
Along with these language came a certain worldview, a certain philosophy behind this. So once you give into that philosophy, you're gone. We gotta say, no, I have a completely different worldview, I have a different perspective. Free speech is not designed to be oppressive. Free speech is to allow us to have the most amount of freedom.
Absolutely.
And the reason why they again, exactly what you said, they see religious freedom of speech as just basically hiding your bigotry, your hatred, and all these different things. And it's the government's job. It's not the church's job. It's not your parents' job. It's the government's job to make sure that you're not a hater. You're a nice guy, and that means you have to abide by all these social norms that these elitists create in their own little thing, and you have to abide. That means you're a nice guy, because if you're mean, and because you say mean words, you tweet mean things, that means you're a hater, you're a bad person, and government should punish you for that. No longer government is just kind of more restraining true evil. Government's job is to make sure everyone's a nice person.
Yeah. And
according to them.
And we saw this fleshed out as high as the Supreme Court. And he goes into this, I won't get lost in the weeds, but the U.S. versus Windsor basically was, the argument was on a domestic partnership that they should be getting the same rights as married couples. Of course, in that decision, it was a 5-4 decision that overturned that portion of DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, that said that marriage was exclusively between a man and a woman. Now, this has been history since the foundation of history itself. Marriage between a man and a woman is obvious as the nose on your face. But this was the language. They said it imposes a stigma on same-sex couples. Now, a stigma is simply a moral verdict that says some behavior is right and some behavior is wrong. Some behavior is good, some behavior is bad. What we've said for years is same-sex relationships are not healthy, they're not good, they're not biblical, they're not God-blessed, and that two men or two women are not married, because by definition there has to be a man and a woman. That's what marriage is. So we were arguing about what is the definition of marriage itself. But notice when the Supreme Court said it imposes a stigma, what they're saying is imposing a stigma on any behavior or making a moral discrimination is wrong of any sort, except it doesn't come back on us.
Well, no, you're just putting a stigma for anyone who believes in traditional marriage.
Exactly. Now we're the stigma. We're the one stigma.
You're just transferring one stigma to another, which, again, doing it through legislative means is one thing, and doing it through the courts is another. And that's kind of what bothers me, because it was done through the courts.
Well, all of this, every major gain from the left was won through the courts. It was all judicial activism.
By the way, right now there's a pending bill that's they call it the Respect for Marriage Act, or whatever.
In fact, I'm on a live briefing on that right after this podcast today. After
Tony Perkins, I saw about.
Yep.
Yeah, which you have to. I mean, I've been writing Todd Young.
Yeah. Serious.
I just wrote Todd. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit.
This impacts all of us.
Yeah.
So here's the deal: objections to gay marriage were considered a matter of, and I'm quoting the language here, constitutional animus, which in normal language means irrational bigotry. So anybody that was against gay marriage, it's because you have an irrational form of bigotry. Now that in and of itself is an incredible moral statement, because it goes against 2 millennia of belief of Christians that marriage is between a man and a woman, and basically stigmatize us, as you just pointed out, and said that we're just a bunch of irrational bigots. So Windsor provided the legal background for the Obergefell-Hodges constitutional case, siding with gay marriage, and it emphasized the autonomy of individuals in being able to choose whom they wanted to marry. And I wanted to read the Justice Kennedy, because Kennedy here is preaching expressive individualism, which is what we're talking about. This was the strange ruling that he gave in the majority summary. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters should not define the attributes of personhood where they formed under compulsion of the state.
There's so many contradictions in there that I can't even. Compulsion of the state. So someone's If someone's belief in life, their mystery, their meaning, universe, is to murder the whole neighborhood. if that's their meaning, is it not under the compulsion of, I know I'm using a very extreme example, but that statement in itself, I mean, is it not under the compulsion of state to make sure this guy doesn't murder the whole neighborhood if he self-identifies the meaning of life as a murderer?
Well, what we saw here, what's most important, we move from objective, legal, clearly defined terminology into really metaphysical. It's almost religious language.
Well, that's what I'm saying. He's become the high priest.
Yeah.
Your job as a justice.
But the point for this podcast, I think, is that statement is the embodiment of expressive individualism.
Yeah.
It recognizes a shift in the thinking of some of the members of the court, that basically whatever you feel is right for you, there's no outside authority that can say, well, that's not right or that's wrong, or we can't even touch it, because you have the power to define your own existence.
But it's contradicted, because you're telling a whole other group of people they don't have the power, and you're using the power of state to compel them otherwise. So you're
exactly right.
This is what it's so frustrating.
And that's what happens when you lose a transcendent source of authority, which is why we go back and argue for God and for the truth of God's word. Last point we'll talk about here, because in the time that we have left, is this shift from tolerance to equality. Now, I would define tolerance, the old version of tolerance, meaning I could disapprove of your position, your lifestyle, your choices, but do it respectfully. In other words, we're still Americans, we're still citizens, you're still a human being made in the image and likeness of God, so I'm going to treat you with dignity, even though I might vehemently disagree with your position.
Sure. It's like...
That's like gone.
Right.
And that kind of leads us to what you were saying earlier. I am shocked. Like say you or I would be invited to a state university to give a lecture on why we believe that expressive individualism is a really bad idea, and why the transgender ideology is a threat to public education or something like that. Those topics would be perfectly suited for any university as a topic of interest. Students could come out, they could listen, we could have question and answer time, they could push back, we could have a wonderful, logical, meaningful, tolerant discussion. But that's not happening now. Whenever a conservative, especially a white male, patriarchal, heteronormative, all these terms that we have, if you fit in any of those descriptions and you're invited to speak on a college campus, there will be an uproar. Even the faculty would be against it, and they will cancel you. Like, if you got invited, you'll get disinvited. If you actually show up, there will probably be an attack on your person. There will be physical violence. There will be yelling and screaming. There will be a disrupting blowhorns. We've seen this in our universities, and you brought out a really good point. Why is it that something that used to be a liberal hallmark, right, a liberal virtue, freedom of speech, that used to be the buzzword on campuses, right? Now we're not seeing freedom of speech. We're seeing freedom of speech actually shut down everywhere. But the reason behind it is rather interesting, because again, it reflects the shift that we've seen in understanding personhood. Talk about the cancel culture and what you said, the whole Marxist template that's overlaid this between oppressors and the oppressed as it relates to free speech.
Right.
Like, why am I shut down? Why can't I come on campus? Why can't I share a Christian worldview?
Yeah, because we don't, the freedom of speech, there's no longer a respect for freedom of speech as the original means. It's no longer valued. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech are not valued. Those, the First Amendment, along with the Second Amendment, these are all seen as dangerous to whatever institution they want to create. The establishment. And the reason is because they're seen as oppressive tools. They're simply tools. It's like the police. They're tools to keep those who are oppressed down. And that's the paradigm you see it. So when people mention freedom of speech, you don't hear freedom to exchange idea. You don't hear equality. You don't hear like growth. All you hear is it's just a moniker. It's just a term to oppress people. So even that word freedom of speech no longer means what it means. Well, it means something to you. It doesn't mean anything to the other side. And we got to understand that.
In other words, this is shocking to me as I started reading about critical race theory and some of these things. The basic argument is those who are currently in the oppressor category have forfeited their freedom of speech, because say I'm a white guy, which I am, and say you're an Asian guy,
I'll try to pretend. I'll try to
Let's just say
that.
you're the victimized Asian, and I'm the oppressive white guy. Because I'm not Asian, and I can't be. I guess I could be, depending on how much we believe that we can.
That's how fluid are we?
How
really?
fluid we are.
Right.
But let's just say I can't be in this situation. I can never be you.
Yeah.
That means I can't experience your history.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like to be an Asian. I don't know the kind of racism you've been victimized by. And because I can never experience what you have experienced, therefore, by definition, I don't have the right to speak.
Yep.
So I can't even talk to you. I can't share my opinions with you. I can't seek to even bridge it because I'm the oppressor, you're the oppressed, and because you're the oppressed, I am no longer able to even have anything to say about what's going on. So they shut you down. They're like, we don't want to hear you. And in fact, this is crazy because it's creating a reverse racism culture in America.
Reverse oppressive culture.
Yeah, because now we're not talking about on the virtue of race. We're talking about the whole Marxist template of oppressor oppressed. So now there are places on universities where white people aren't even allowed. Now this takes us all the way back to when black people couldn't go in certain restaurants or couldn't become members of certain golf courses. And so we tried to tear all that down so that we could all be together. And now all we've done is we've flipped the template, and now we're just creating a reverse form of racism.
Let me read this part that kind of ties it all together. Okay, this is from chapter 8 of the book Strange New World. The claim that certain narratives are psychologically oppressive. Okay, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Your story, is psychologically oppressive. Free speech, freedom of religion is psychologically oppressive. Is plausible to many because our modern intuitions are to see ourselves as psychological beings, and anything that obstructs our psychological happiness, our sense of self, is bad, oppressive, and something to be opposed. Okay, victimhood therefore has an intrinsic virtue to it.
Right.
Think about that for a second. In this context, when you are a victim, you cling to victims, you go out your way to say, what can I be a victim by? Because there's intrinsic virtue in this Marxist scheme. Everyone's racing to become the first victim because the more victim you are, the more virtue you have.
The higher moral ground you have.
Anything that can lay claim to the vocabulary of the victim has unlocked a major, even irresistible source of cultural power in that culture today. Mm-hmm. Freedom of speech and academic freedom simply licenses to oppress and marginalize the weak. True freedom is found in closing down such traditional virtues and replacing them with victim-centered authoritarianism. So it becomes a culture, a religion of victim. How can I express myself? How can I label myself as many more victim terms? See, it's interesting because we were taught, and from what I read from MLK Jr., is we're taught not to be thinking like victims, to think like victors.
Right.
The Bible teaches us to be that we are victors and not that we are perpetually victim. It actually diminishes us. But in this religional context, the person racing to the top, become the number one victim, is the winner.
Yep. And what's scary in our places again of higher learning, higher education, which I use in quote marks because it's not higher learning at all. But what we're seeing is a victim-centered authoritarianism, meaning if you're not seeing this orthodoxy off the orthodoxy sheet, and you're not in the victim oppressed paradigm, the Marxist paradigm, you are canceled. You're not even allowed to get a job in those universities. You are marginalized. You are overlooked for promotion. If you're a student, you're vilified and attacked. It's very much authoritarianism. It opens the door to tyranny. It says this is the only way you can believe. If you don't believe, the state punishes you. The university punishes you. And this should be, this should concern all of us. I got kids now that are college age, and I'm really reconsidering where in the world I would send my kids. Even a lot of the Christian universities are completely woke. Yeah. Because again, we're looking at the signs of the times and realizing things are very, very ripe for a lot of evil to happen in the hands of the powerful. It's interesting. I was just listening to an incredible book called "The Happiest Man on Earth." I think it's a story of a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, unbelievable. But he was just saying how similar the times are in America to the rise of what he experienced in Nazi Germany. And it's funny because they always talk about us, like the establishment, as we're fascists, we're enemies of democracy. It's just the opposite. The left is the most progressive fascist entity on planet Earth, and you see the signs of all of this kind of totalitarianism that's springing up everywhere when government gets out of control.
And we're not a democracy, we're a democratic republic.
Yeah, well, that's a republic.
That's another, because that's what it said. Oh, it's a threat against democracy. Hold up, we're not mob rule.
Yeah.
We're not mob rule.
No.
So, but next week, we're going to talk about something really interesting, because the final chapter of this book, it talks about what are some things we can do.
Yeah, and you came in here a little bit bummed out because you read the last chapter, so we're gonna have to drill a little deeper.
I think I need to have a little chat with Carl Truman and kind of encourage him a little bit, because there's a lot we can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot we can do. I know we're philosophizing about a lot of different things, but I want to make it practical. There's things we can do with our hands even right now, even with our kids. I got young kids. I can't check out, man. I got kids and grandkids to think about.
Absolutely.
Got to put our hands to the plow.
I'll just say this too. The whole premise of why he wrote that book was we cannot bring about transformation and change until we're aware of how we got where we're at.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've been endeavoring to do in this series of podcasts is help connect the intellectual and philosophical dots, so that we realize when you're looking at this craziness, there is actually a logic behind it, a reason behind it. So anyway, hope this is helpful to you. Again, we love hearing back from you. Send those comments. Make sure you share this widely. And until next week, keep your heads up. Jesus is Lord. We win.